Welcome to the Future Is Freelance podcast, brought to you by Xolo, the operating system of the solo economy. Every week, we'll be serving up an audio cocktail of expert tips, inspired insights, and stories from the frontiers of freelancing to help you grow your borderless business to new heights and live life on your own terms. So kick back, grab a snack, and let's get started. Thank you for joining us for today's episode and not being one of the people who scrolled on past when they saw the word tax in the episode title. Because believe me, you can't avoid this stuff when you're a freelancer, when you're a solopreneur, a digital nomad, self-employed. Believe me, you need to start engaging with your tax situation. However, as John Lee, today's episode guest, says quite clearly, don't live your life around it. Figure out what you need, get the right professional support, and then make decisions based on your personal preferences and interests, because all of this stuff is fixable. It's not rocket science. There are people like John, who you'll meet shortly, who have built the tools which can help you or help a hirer navigate that situation. And when you combine that with the power of a setup like Estonian e-residency, it's just like using Xolo to make all your admin and bookkeeping disappear. You really can set this stuff up correctly in the first place and then run with it. But don't take my word for it. John Lee, before founding Work From Anywhere, is a true digital nomad. He's taken his family on the road. He's lived in dozens of different countries. He's great at explaining this stuff and making it accessible. So I really encourage you to dig in and have a listen and learn from his wisdom and experience about the whole future of freelancing and mobility and being location independent and the way things are going in terms of digital nomad visas, global taxation, and what you need to look out for. So maybe take some notes if you're at all concerned about your situation. There are links you can follow up with John, other places to get advice, talk to your Xolo representative if you're one of our customers. This stuff, as I say, it shouldn't scare you. It's part of life. It's an inevitability. So let's smile and embrace it and enjoy this conversation. So welcome, John. It's great to have you with us here at the Future Is Freelance.
Thank you very much for having me, Maya. Pleasure to be here.
I've been looking forward to this conversation, but before we dig into your startup, Work From Anywhere, I'd love to know a little bit about your backstory and how you ended up where you are and doing what you're doing, because it's a great freelance story.
No, appreciate it, Maya. I have to say it's been an interesting journey for me as well, and seeing the different options that are out there, both as an entrepreneur or a freelancer. And I think really just the future of work has really shifted so quickly in the last couple of years. It's kind of brought us forward, accelerated us 10 years. So excited to talk about where the different options are.
Fantastic. So you're talking to me from Portugal at the moment. That's become your home base. You're a properly mobile family, right?
Yeah, we definitely are. My eldest daughter, Rosa, she is 6 in the last week, turned 6, and she's been to 25 countries. So that'll give you an idea. So myself and Dee are real avid travelers. We have a real passion for traveling the world. We've traveled to, I think between the two of us, together we've traveled to over 60 countries, and I think between the two of us traveled to maybe over 80 countries together. So yeah, we've a really deep passion for it, and for us, having kids hasn't stopped us. It really hasn't. I mean, obviously, the pandemic certainly did had a bit of a pause for a while, but even so, I mean, for us, for all of us, we have Rosa, who's now 6, Esme is 3, and Barra is 1, and we are already looking forward to the next trip.
Fantastic. Well, I want to hear about your future plans as well, but tell me what you've been building this year, because that's a really exciting thing that's going to be useful for all the freelancers and flexible workers listening to this show.
Yeah, sure. So, well, first of all, one of the things that we do have that people will be might be aware of already if they visit our website is we have a bunch of resources available, open source, free resources for freelancers, individuals to help them figure out some of the tax challenges. But what we've basically built in the last year is a product for companies, basically companies to allow them to figure out how to hire work from anywhere. And what you find is that too often when it comes to looking to work cross-border, companies put up the barriers. They find a way to say no, and they often blame taxes or employment law. And the tool that we have, it's basically a way to get to yes. And it'll basically tell companies in each scenario, okay, what is the way that you can, find a way through this? And then basically what it means is that in different scenarios, maybe a solution might be to set up a legal entity or to hire somebody as a contractor or to use an employer of record, which is a new solution in the last couple of years, or a digital nomad visa. And what's fascinating is that companies are not really that aware of employers of record or digital nomad visas, but they are really wonderful tools, both for the individual and for the companies in many cases, especially if somebody has a real passion for wanting to work in a particular country.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I set up my Estonian company 4 years ago precisely because of difficulties in contracting with overseas organizations who just couldn't cope with somebody being simply self-employed in Europe if they're in the US or Asia. And now we have so many more options. I mean, I'm not saying the pandemic was a good thing, but there are certainly upsides that have come out of it. But I know you've been working in this space for a long time, and I wonder if, where freelancers used to lead the way, we were the ones who were mobile and flexible. Did you see this coming for employment as well? Did you see this explosion coming? Because it seems to me that you've been working on just the tools that we need for a long time.
Well, yeah, I think for me, one of the ones that really blew up was it was an article, I think it was in Sifted. It was by Gonzalo Hall. It was over a year, maybe a year and a half ago. And he talked about in Madeira, pre-pandemic, only about 10% of the digital nomads there were corporate nomads, as in people, employees who were working for companies. Whereas this was already over a year ago, he was saying it was over 50% were corporate nomads. So I think if you think of it, let's take a step back for a second. When we as a family were traveling all around the world, we were, I suppose, just a traditional, classical digital nomad family. There wasn't very many digital nomads knocking around the world. There was maybe a handful, maybe a couple of million. And when there's 1.2 billion travelers every year around the world, a couple of million is not a huge percentage, you can imagine. But the difference now is what's happened is with remote work, you now obviously have so many more types of digital nomads. And actually, for me, I don't even call them digital nomads. I call them, you've got the classical digital nomads, but then you've got your slow nomads, but then you've also remote workers. And remote workers is the huge market. That's people that have a base. And you could maybe potentially put slow nomads into this as well, but people that have a base and maybe want to go traveling for maybe 3-4 months a year, I want to come back to that base. Yeah. So to give you some very tangible numbers here, American Airlines pre-pandemic, they mentioned how in their recent investor update, how pre-pandemic 20 to 25% of their travel was mixed, as in mixed between leisure and business. Whereas more or less in the last year, let's say, they've noticed that it's between 50 and 55%. So the majority of travel is workation. The original purpose is probably still the same. It's business or leisure. But now the fact that people are mixing, they're adding on leisure to business travel trip, or they're adding on business onto leisure travel trip. And so, for me, that's fascinating. That really is. That's whole explosion and what that means for the future of work, for the future of travel, for the future of how we live. Is truly fascinating.
It's so exciting, isn't it, to see these silos coming down. I remember writing a few years ago at the start of the pandemic, writing about working from home and about the way that some people needed quite hard boundaries on that. That's my office over there, and I close the laptop and I only use my phone in the evenings or whatever, and our different degrees of comfort with blending those things together. And it seems to me that you're right. We need a new term that encompasses digital nomads and remote workers and people who work flexibly in a location-independent way, whether as solos or entrepreneurs, that somehow embraces that blended lifestyle, that we add on a few days extra on a trip, but we take our laptop when we're going on holiday so that we can stay a bit longer because we know we can catch up on work.
100%. I think also challenging even our traditional definitions of digital nomads. I think a lot of people had the misconception that digital nomads were people in their early 20s who were traveling, every 2 or 3 weeks from country to country. But if you look at, for example, Peter Levels with Nomad List, he did analysis and tweeted about this a couple of months ago, how they did analysis and more or less people do, digital nomads do move maybe every month or so, but actually they move within a country. And so they stay within a particular country, typically for 3 or 4 months time on average. So I thought that was quite interesting, that if challenging our traditional concepts of what do we see, how do we see digital nomads, that I know, with Nomads, they're only a sub-segment of digital nomads, to be fair, but they're one of the most open source databases that give us some insights on that particular data set as well. The other data point in it as well is they're typically reasonably high earning people as well. And so that's also interesting. But, the ability to, for example, earn money in dollars from a US client and be able to use that for geo arbitrage to travel around in different parts of the world, for example, as well. So all these things is, one question leads to another one. But for me, it's fascinating to see where does this end up over the next 5 or 10 years for companies, for work, for the freelancers, for all of us, even for parents and families,
Yes, absolutely. And, trying to take those solutions on the road with you for education and things like that as well. It's really exciting, and it is an amazing time to be writing about it, podcasting about it, and seeing what people like you are building, that infrastructure that's going to underpin it. So I think obviously tax is the big one that holds back a lot of people from fulfilling these dreams. And as you said, it does hold back a lot of potential employers as well. So for freelancers then, for people who are listening to this show, they might have a business or they might be simply freelance where they're currently tax resident, what are the main things that they should think about if they want to be a bit more mobile, a bit more nomadic in the new year, perhaps?
Great question. Well, for me, what I often come back to people is I say, don't lead your life by tax. I often say, listen, figure out yourself what you want out of your life, what's important to you, what's important to where you want to travel to. I do think there's definite benefits to trying to map out your life for the next couple of years and trying to pick some kind of administrative base where you can either have your company set up, for example, looking at your bank accounts, things like that. And there are certainly some smart ways you can certainly go about it. I mean, I do think with the likes of the Estonia, for example, the different options there are well worth a look. But trying to find that right balance, which it's dependent on a number of factors. It'll also depend on what passport you have, where you're from, your citizenship, your residency as well can all factor into it. But for us, for example, when we were deciding to move to Portugal, we put together a kind of a spreadsheet of all the different factors in every country in the world and ranking it every country in the world for those factors. And you've got some great tools like Nomad List, for example. We looked at other ones. For us, kids' education was important. So there's a CEO World Best to Raise Kids. Is a really, really good platform, for example, to assess kids' education. But we looked at a whole bunch of other factors that were important to us in deciding where to move to. And based on that, we more or less came to the conclusion that Portugal was good for us. And clearly for us, we also looked at the tax side of it as well. I think it's absolutely critical to look at, for example, double taxation agreements, looking at the different countries that you're planning on spending most of your time in or having your base in, making sure that there is, for example, double taxation agreements in place. And I think just doing your research as well on understanding the nuances, because part of the challenge is that in some countries they can have what you would call as a very kind of a black and white approach to how they set up let's say tax rules. So they can have you can have, for example, a civil law approaching, and things can be very centralized, can be very, very clear. But then you can have other countries, for example, where it's not at all clear, where it's more of a principles-based approach, and there's a bit of a lack of certainty, and they can also be very decentralized. Look at, for example, certain countries, like take, for example, the US. The variation in states just for payroll taxes alone can be extremely tricky to navigate. So I think factoring all those things into your considerations is really, really important. And the good thing is, though, is there's lots of really helpful resources out there that can help freelancers come to the right conclusion, the right decision.
Yeah. So if you think about those lifestyle things first, what you want for your kind of housing, what you want for your family, what your future plans are, then hopefully you can find the right jurisdiction in which to base yourself for tax purposes and still live the life that you need. obviously a lot of the audience for this show are people who are Estonian e-residents or who are considering that status. To what extent do you think e-residency helps the tax situation? I've heard, obviously, people sometimes have a misconception that Estonia is a tax haven, which we're very keen to correct at every stage. But what might operating as an e-resident with a company based in Estonia do to make that decision easier?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, one of the big things is having Estonian e-residency. You now have a company that's based in Europe. That can certainly help. Certainly for people that are coming from outside of Europe, for example, having a European company can certainly give that little bit more credibility, can make it easier to win some of those client relationships, for example. I think some of the practical implications, you've got to separate the company tax residency and your individual tax residency. Some people might have the misconception that, if I just register a company in Estonia, then I do all my invoicing there, or they might put it in the States or wherever it might be, that takes care of my residency problem. It doesn't at all. It obviously helps for the company tax residency, but for individual tax residency, that really depends on where you're spending your time. And I mean, sometimes with tax lawyers, they tend to make it sound very, very complicated. But at the end of the day, it's very simple. Where you spend most of your time is where you're going to be individually tax resident, and that's where you need to map out and have a thought through where you want to have, as I said, your base from. Coming back to it. On the company tax residency, definitely, by registering it in, let's say, for example, Estonia, you'll be able to have that base. But again, you have to do your research on the country that you're going to be spending most of your time in, because if it's not Estonia, well, then you have to look at the tax laws of the country you're going to be spending most of your time in, because part of the challenge is that, if you split tax residency between two aspects, one is individual tax residency. That's where you typically have people often talk about the 183 days a year. That's actually a bit of a myth. Some countries it's a lot less than that. Sometimes some countries a bit more. But let's say, for argument's sake, let's take it as a given that in a lot of countries it's 183 days. So if you're over 6 months in a country, you'll trigger individual tax residency. Where it gets tricky is that on the company tax residency, your corporate tax residency, really depends on the jurisdiction that you yourself are performing the work and services in. So some countries have what you call a wide definition of corporate tax residency. And they'll more or less say, they use things like, for example, this concept of economic employer approach, for example. And essentially what it means is that, if you're spending, for argument's sake, let's say you're spending most of your time working from, let's say, for example, Greece. And let's say Greece were very strict on corporate tax residency, which is called permanent establishment. The Greek tax authorities, if you're generating your revenue from there, the Greek tax authorities might come along and say, I'm sorry, I know you registered a company in a different country, but actually we're going to claim the tax revenue for this. So doing your research in advance to make sure you've got tax advisors in both in this case, Estonia, and the country you're going to be spending most of your time in is really, really important. And I think it gets tricky. I mean, if you're going to be spending a couple of weeks in a country, you're not going to have this risk, but to a large degree. But the problem is, if you're going to be spending a couple of months, or certainly more than 6 months in a country, you've got to be careful. Plus, if you're going to be generating the revenue, if you're going to be invoicing from into that country, you've got to be very, very, very careful how you do it, because some countries, as I said, have a very wide, very strict definition of what permanent establishment. Others have a very narrow definition of it. So trying to find that is one aspect. And the other aspect of it that's critical is looking at double taxation agreements as well. They can certainly help. So if you end up having to pay tax in that destination country, at least you can claim it back as a credit in the home country. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really important. Is there anything that solopreneurs operating out of Estonia should be particularly aware of? To give you an example, I've been advised not to work with clients in Spain through my Estonian company, which is, as I can't write in Spanish professionally, that's not a problem anyway. But I've been advised sort of definitely don't do that, because then that will look much more to the tax authorities like it is a locally run business as opposed to something digital. So
the big thing is, as a freelancer, are you, did you set up a company in Estonia and you're in, and that company is being invoiced to, let's say the client is in, let's say the Estonian company is invoicing the client, or are you working as a registered freelancer in, for example, Spain, if you're working as let's say there's various different types of freelancing models, for example, but essentially it comes down to, do you set up a company and that's invoicing the client? And maybe you're paying yourself a salary out of that company, you're paying yourself dividends and whatnot. So taking the company route over here. And then on the other side of the equation is you're actually registered as a freelancer in that particular country, in the case of Spain. If you're registered as a freelancer, you're more or less tied to that residency in Spain. Whereas in the case of, let's say, Estonian e-residency, you'll likely have more options that you can look at, either paying yourself as a salary or taking dividends out, for example. I think one is like, for example, in the case of Portugal, they have an NHR regime, which has got some quite attractive tax benefits as well, for example. But looking at, for example, at dividends in some countries, foreign dividends are tax-free, in others are not. So figuring out the right mix and doing your research, I cannot emphasize enough that if you are going to be spending, more than a few months or a year in a country, it very often is worth at least getting a tax consultation to see what are the different options. I mean, that's what we did. We basically, before we moved to Portugal, and made sure to get tax advice on both the Irish side and the Portuguese side. But the good thing is, from my dealing with Estonia, they are very helpful. They have good tax advisors, and obviously Xolo is a great platform as well. My experience in Estonia is they're very, very helpful. The big thing, though, is that you've got to watch out with the definition of two things: permanent establishment, which is corporate tax residency, and the other aspect you've got to watch out in Europe is EU anti-shell company legislation. And what that means is that they're trying to cut down on people just setting up a company in a jurisdiction just to avoid tax. Yeah. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to make sure that there's some safeguards in that just to stop people, being overly aggressive on that piece. So again, that's where a good tax lawyer will be able to tell you what is coming down the track, how you can prevent and watch out, and do it in a way that is 100% above board, fully compliant. And it's better off, some people say, well, I don't want to spend $1,000 or $2,000 on tax advice. Well, think of it like insurance. Would you pay for insurance for your business? You probably would. Well, in this case, I think one of the things we're definitely seeing is that, a lot of countries relaxed the tax audits during the pandemic. But we're going to see this change now over the next 2 or 3 years, particularly with the amount and internationalization of talent and mobility, and people, freelancers being able to move around the world. It used to be the billionaires are optimizing for their taxes. Now it's people like you and me who have the ability to do that, which is something I think that the tax authorities themselves are watching out. So spend the time in getting it right.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And, these tax consultants, they do have a high hourly rate because they are experts in this space, and they're giving you indemnified written advice as well. So you actually have some comeback on it. And as you say, if you have to spend 4 figures on that, that's nothing compared to a tax investigation from a country that's determined to look over everything you've earned for. They could go back 6 years or 10 years and take you apart. So it's really, as you say, it's insuring against that risk. That's part of your business due diligence.
And tying on to that as well, I'm happy to share some resources afterwards, but there are some good resources that can be helpful for people. I'm happy to share them afterwards, but there's some really good resources. Obviously, we've got Xolo. Visa DB has got access to some good tax advisors as well, but there's some good general guides about taxes as well. Good communities. Nomad list, Nomad base is another good one as well. I think there's some really, really helpful communities out there of other freelancers, and also as well on the freelance platforms and the likes of, for example, TopTal, for example, that has a Slack channels by country, a bit like Nomad list as well. And what you find is that, generally speaking, Reddit as well, even freelancers are pretty good at helping each other out and sharing advice. So there's a lot you can learn from just speaking to somebody else who's in a similar situation who went into a country. The only thing I would say though is that you've got to be careful if somebody gave an advice about going to, for example, I don't know, Bulgaria, for argument's sake, but they didn't have, a similar situation from similar passports or citizenship residencies and whatnot. The answer that worked for them might not be the same answer that works for you. So again, just be careful and be cautious about somebody copying and pasting other solutions. But at the same time, I think there is good value in connecting with other members of the community in that country.
Yeah, 100%. It's great to go on these forums to do your research and information gathering. When it comes to taking advice that you're going to base life decisions on, then definitely go and talk to a qualified professional. You see it in all the Facebook groups and things like that. There's some terrible advice often being dished out by people, which might be correct for them, but their circumstances are completely different. Or they, like the whole Brexit thing. So we try not to say that word on this podcast, but we're not going to beep it out. But there are so many issues now with Brits wanting to relocate to Europe. And there's so much terrible advice being given out just on the Spain forums and Facebook groups. And
okay, what's the worst piece of advice? What's the worst piece of advice you heard so far?
I think the worst piece of advice tend to be the kind of follow your dreams, do it, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, there's absolutely no way they can do what they're suggesting.
It's funny you say that. I saw somebody recently share a video, I think it was on LinkedIn, I think it was, and they more or less said, oh yeah, for work from anywhere, just go, even if your HR says no, it doesn't matter, just go and it's fine. Who cares? It's just do it. And I was looking at this going, if there's people who are going to be following this poor idiot's advice, there's going to be a lot of individuals and companies who are going to get in serious trouble. I mean, I do believe in pushing the boundaries where you can, but within reason. And I think that's part of the challenge. Yeah.
Are you feeling inspired about your own freelance future? Maybe nurturing a business idea of your own, which could create the lifestyle of your dreams? Xolo is the perfect place to bring those dreams to life with an intuitive tech stack and business support suite designed around what every freelancer needs. Whether you want a quick and easy way to raise an invoice or an EU-based fully featured private limited company of your own, Xolo is the place to take care of your back office admin in just 10 minutes a day, so you can concentrate on transforming your vision into reality. Visit Xolo.io, that's Xolo with an X, or check out the link in your show notes for our latest offers. Absolutely, but you've got to push the boundaries carefully and sensibly and test where they are, because some of them you just can't do anything about. And things like residence and visas and stuff like that, it's going to come back and bite you.
100%. I think one of the things just on that as well, Maya, is that what we've already seen is different tax authorities and some of the countries that do have a high tax rates. Places like the UKs, the Switzerlands, the Canadas, the USs of this world, they're starting to put together and have been for the last year cross-departmental task forces to go after these remote workers that are not declaring their income. So they're seeing a lot of people remote work relocating outside of, let's say, for argument's sake, the UK, naturally, because people are going, well, look, if I can work from the south of Spain or Portugal, whatnot, why wouldn't I? But against that, then, because they're losing a lot of that tax base, they're now seeing a lot of people coming in to visit, for example, for a couple of months and not declaring the tax income. So that's one of the ones to watch out for. What you could get away with if people were pushing the boundaries too much, pushing the envelope too much. They need to watch out for that, because I think there's going to be a few horror stories shared towards the beginning of I'd say of next year, where we'll hear more about this.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, and it is to do with that shift in numbers, isn't it? When it was only a few thousand people living like this, they could move around the world much more discreetly, and it probably wasn't seen as something worth going after to try and tax people just there. For I give you
an example. Two very clear examples. The first one is when we were in Thailand. We spent 6 months there in 2018. We did the visa runs all day.
Right.
You technically you're not supposed to do it. We did it. We've all been there before, and no one batted an eyelid. There was not, a huge amount of digital families like we were doing it, and it was fine. Whereas this time, when we were back there in Christmas, we noticed them getting very strict and checking everything and asking the questions. And I think again, what you could get away with before. Yeah. And what you get away with now is very, very different. The other aspect as well that's fascinating to think about this is the digitalization of the world that we saw with COVID that accelerated digitalization. Naturally enough, that's accelerated digitalization of the border, immigration and tax authorities. And so where we're seeing now a challenge is that now all of a sudden some immigration authority databases are speaking to the tax databases. And of course, all of a sudden now you have you're being flagged. Like places like Singapore, for example, and others, where because they're speaking to each other, they're already proactively flagging. Hold on a second, you've been here a certain period of time. Have you filed your tax report, your tax reporting? So things like that really worth watching out for.
Yes, and the financial convergence of data sharing as well, and this sort of move towards more of a cashless society. But I mean, I think even somebody just that has an amount coming into their bank account that looks like it doesn't originate from a taxable source within the country that you're living in and things like that, it's going to end up tripping up a lot of people. As you say, I think we'll see some case histories emerging, some precedents that will probably shake things up a bit and improve practice and regulation, and maybe encourage some people to look a bit more closely at their own situation before it blows up in their face. But we do have things coming along to help people. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot on this show this year has been the explosion in digital nomad visas and remote work visas. What are your thoughts about that? Is it making things easier, better? Is it confusing matters further? And where do you see this going? Will every country have a remote work visa next year?
Yeah, well, in general, companies haven't embraced digital nomad visas yet, but they will soon. Some companies are. My own view, digital nomad visas, first of all, they're called the wrong thing. They're not digital nomad visas. They're remote work visas. They're 100%. Called digital nomad visas for a marketing employee. But essentially, they are really wonderful tools for destinations and for companies and for individuals. From a freelancing perspective, trying to understand which of the remote work visas are available for freelancers, because you need to look at the conditions. I mean, some of them are poorly. I would say my own view is, I would say probably just maybe over half of them are actually poorly designed with, maybe too high income threshold, or the tax consideration is not fully thought through, or maybe not marketed the right way, or not done in a fully integrated way with both tax and border and immigration authorities, for example. But you know what? A number of them have actually been really well designed. And take, for example, Barbados. Barbados, the welcome stamp there generated over $100 million for the local economy since it was launched. And I think Bermuda, Mita Carmen, and eventually has written blogs on this. But in Bermuda, they have like $28 million that they've generated for the local economy. So you can imagine Barbados, COVID comes along, it absolutely ruins the cruise industry. Yeah. And they're thinking, what can we do? They launched this digital visa, and all of a sudden they're getting these kind of numbers. So if it's designed right and if it's done well, they can be great tools. And for companies, I think they're fantastic. You have very practical examples where, you're trying to get a really talented, for example, engineer in. You want to get him into, for example, the US, but maybe you're waiting for a H-1B visa. It's taking too long to get for. Well, you can offer these other visas like this as an opportunity for them to work in a wonderful place, work remotely, and still have the options later on in many cases of being able to go for those other visas. So the ability to park them in different places. Let's say for freelancers, I mean, you've even more freedom. You've got not just the digital visas, there's other visas not called digital visas, but that are open to freelancers that you can use. Germany, for example, is one. There's many others as well. So thinking through and doing your research. Again, I would go back for good resources in this. I would say VisaDB is a good one of general visas. On our own website, we've got a list of digital visas as well that we're thinking about. The big thing to make sure, though, is make sure that clarify the tax piece of it, because if you're not careful, I mean, these digital visas, many of them require you not to work for a local employer, which should be fine. But some of them cover you for tax, some of them don't for income tax. And do the research. For example, capital gains tax is another one. So some of them will say you won't be a tax resident for income tax, but you want to make sure you don't start selling a big bunch of crypto or shares while you're there in case you trigger some other taxes. So again, for these, just being smart about how you do it, basically, and avoiding any pitfalls.
Yeah, so digging in the small print and comparing. I know that there's Xolo have an article on their site, which we can link to as well, which, I mean, the thing is, it has to be updated every week because this is such a fast-moving target. It looks like we're finally getting the digital nomad visa in Spain that everybody's been clamoring for months, if not years. But one of the things that's controversial about it, and I'm sure this is a problem in other places too, is that it looks like it's going to be much more tax advantageous for new arrivals than it is for long-term remote workers who are settled and take residency. Do you think that's going to be a problem, or is that mainly a Europe problem?
Yeah. It's funny. I was actually moderating a session, worked from anywhere at the World Travel Market last week in London. I was speaking with the mayor of Cape Town on this particular topic, and this is a challenge because if you think of like destinations, they're looking to create places that are great places to visit, but also great places to live. And I think this is one of the ones that we've really got to watch out for. What are the unintended consequences? What are the second and third degree impacts? We had also protests at the Web Summit in Lisbon, for example, the week before last on this. So I think every program that's launched has to be very carefully designed, because if you look at it from the, let's say, perspective of countries or destinations, what are they looking to do? Well, places like Spain, it's quite obvious. They're seeing, I mentioned the statistics from American Airlines, that over half of travel is now mixed. So they're seeing that this is a huge segment of the travel market. So they're trying to attract these high-earning remote workers, and they're making a bet and saying, look, if we had a choice between either getting cruise passengers and maybe stag and hen parties in who don't spend a huge amount of money but cause a lot of friction, we've got those over here, or we can try and get remote workers in who will better integrate culturally. They'll be here for longer, they'll cause less friction, and they'll spend more in the local economy. Well, you can imagine the destinations are going to be going for those all day. So they can basically say, listen, we'll give them 0% income tax because they'll only be here for a specific period of time. But for that period of time, they'll pay us the money. Revenue we'll be getting will be the money we'll be charging for the actual digital nomad visa, and that's what they'll have to pay. But essentially, they're making a bet on this future segment. So, but I think you're right, though, Maya. I think that the challenge is the short term, let's say, remote workers versus the ones that are longer term, that are embedding themselves more deeper into the culture, into the country and whatnot. And the locals as well. Also the locals, but if you manage it the wrong way and you have too high an influx of remote workers or people moving from different countries, now all of a sudden, with gentrification and pushing the locals out of those cities and towns is a one to watch out for. So it's a very, very careful balancing act.
Yeah, I think there's so many issues there, but simply on the tax front, I know there's already been pushback, I think, in Malta, of people challenging people who are already residents or locals, challenging the terms of the Nomad visa, because it's giving such an unfair advantage to people who are coming in with a higher income anyway, by and large, because of the minimum thresholds and because of the demographics that are attracted to this lifestyle. And it does seem really unfair that they're getting a much lower tax break than the people who live there and support the economy long term. Whereas other remote work visas, they seem to be moving towards residency and trying to attract people to come and settle. So I don't know, are they just not thought out as well as they could be?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, you've got two different goals here. In some cases, you're looking to attract high value visitors, let's say remote workers, and there might be potentially an innovation spillover from having these very these talented entrepreneurs that might be able to share some of their learnings in the local community, for example. But then you've got the longer term, using it as a tool to get long term residents as well. There's that piece of it. I mean, I think if you take a step back here and look at it from 50,000 feet, what I'm seeing is that in the 90s, countries used corporation tax to attract companies to different destinations, different countries. Yeah. Ireland was certainly one of them. We've seen, look at, for example, many others. Estonia have done some interesting ones, like the Netherlands as well. There's many others. You've had obviously the tax havens as well that have been doing that as well. So essentially, a lot of these countries using the corporation tax lever to bring companies to those countries. What we're seeing now it's actually individuals that countries are looking at. Well, how can we leverage that? Either through low tax for digital visas, things like that. I think that can be a really empowering, positive thing for individuals and for freelancers. But for countries, it's one that we've got to watch out for. What we don't want is to get to a race to the bottom for both individual tax and corporation tax, because now all of a sudden, how are we going to fund the services? How are we going to create sustainability in our government revenues to be able to build the schools, the hospitals, and fund the services that we all need? And so I certainly don't want to race to the bottom. I don't mind a well-crafted, digital nomad program that's trying to attract remote workers in a carefully considered way, balancing that really balancing act. Ultimately, come back to what the government, the mayor of Cape Town said, that you're trying to make a city or a town or a place a great place to visit, but a great place to live. And I think it really, first and foremost, needs to be a great place to live. Yeah. And if we can get that right, then making it a great place to visit is great. And I think the right designed digital nomad program, visa, whatnot, can really contribute to that. A poorly designed one can be negative as well. And so that's the kind of the tightrope that countries are kind of walking at the moment.
Yeah, and I think there's just been this gold rush to try and get this legislation out and package up these visas. This sense that countries are going to lose out if they don't quickly attract these high earning, high spending cohort of digital nomads. So maybe some of it's been rushed through a tiny bit. As you were saying, second and third order consequences just take time to think out and to play out and see how they go. So
and that's part of the challenge. It's been, some of them have been interestingly and reasonably well designed, but they haven't been promoted at all. Right. I've seen Croatia was actually a very interesting one, but wasn't really that well promoted because they focused on traditional tourism, for example. I know we spoke of Malta. Malta, there was a lack of clarity on the tax piece of it. They've been working on resolving that in recent weeks, which is positive. Some of them were just awful designed programs that nobody was willing to take up. Whereas some of them have been well designed, going back to Barbados and Bermuda and those programs as well. There's a lot of lessons that the rest of the world can take from places like that.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's clearly going to be something that we're going to have to keep a close eye on because it's moving so fast and continuing to develop. I suppose we ought to wrap up by just trying to peer into the future a little bit. What are you looking forward to in 2023 on this work from anywhere global mobility front? What are you anticipating? Anything that you're concerned about? And let's get the crystal ball out and just look at that.
So the thing that the things that I'm excited about would be the fact that for freelancers, this is, we've seen the first wave of the early adopters of freelancers have been willing to just up sticks and embrace this opportunity. And for all of you listening, kudos, pat on the back for all of you taking the jump in the last year or two and being brave enough to give it a go. But I think it'll be really interesting to see, you were the early adopters, what will happen now over the next 2 or 3 years and how people begin to, as remote work becomes more structural and embedded, what does that mean for work from anywhere? That's on that piece of it. In terms of the other side of it is also seeing companies embrace this as well. I know, with the potential recession coming, there's some challenges in that aspect. But what is also true is companies themselves are seeing the business case of Work from Anywhere. We're seeing Spotify reduced their attrition by 15% since they launched their Work from Anywhere program, for example. Companies are seeing 7 times more applicants for remote jobs compared to traditional jobs. So I think the business case there for companies is interesting. What am I worried about? Well, for me, I'm worried about the tax authorities getting very, very strict on this. And essentially, the tax audits that took place in 2022 related to the year 2021 when residency laws were relaxed, whereas the tax laws that are in 2023 will relate to 2022. And so I think that's one of the ones to really watch out for. I think there's going to be some real horror stories. And part of the challenge is that governments are so far behind. But one of the good things I would say is that there are some really interesting, like what gets me excited is that when I hear, for example, the likes of, the European Commission, they're working on a kind of a European-wide solution to this that would allow people to work for up to 96 days a year in different countries without having to trigger a whole mountain load of administration and reporting and whatnot. Likewise, in the US, there's been a mobile working bill in the Senate for probably it's over a decade now. We might be lucky to see some progress on that, for example. But I do think what is good is that it's becoming clearer and clearer to both, to governments, to companies, that the world is shifting here and that we're not going back. And I think that itself, in and of itself, will offer a whole bunch of opportunities. The biggest opportunity for me personally is digital nomad families. The opportunities for our kids to spend time deeply learning another culture that they never got before. If you were going on a 1 or 2 week holiday, you were never getting that. Whereas if you're going for 1 or 2 months and seeing solutions like workingwithoutborders.com or Boundless Life and many others that are offering really targeted solutions to, remote working families is for me very, very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, what a time to be alive and to be talking about and working on these issues. This has been such an interesting conversation. I think we're going to have to do this again, John, and just check in, in 6 months, 12 months and see how all of this is unfolding. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on Future Is Freelance.
It was a real pleasure. Thanks very much, Maya. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Future Is Freelance podcast, brought to you by Xolo.io, who offer compliance, taxation, invoicing and admin solutions for fiercely independent solopreneurs across the globe. From simply getting paid to launching a full EU-based limited company, Xolo has you covered thanks to Estonian e-residency and a superb suite of streamlined business software. If you enjoyed the show, please like, rate and comment and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts.